Okay, thank you everyone and good morning. I'm actually going to welcome to the stage Mr Frank Wanganeen, who's going to give us a welcome to country this morning. Thanks, Frank.
Yeah, just before I do the welcome, I just want to talk a little bit about Werribee Oldham event and Tarndanyanga, the place of the red kangaroo. Now we've got Victoria Square just as you go out there, but if you look from an aerial view, it's in the shape of the shield. So that was a very significant place where, like, it was a meeting place for a lot of our mob here, and not only here, but people from all different tribal groups would meet there. So it was a very sort of meeting place, and that's where they would have held conferences like we're doing today. So yeah, and of course one of the reasons why they chose Adelaide, because they had other sites that they wanted to choose to the city of Adelaide, like it was over in Port Lincoln, down at Victor Harbour, and then Cape Jarvis, but they chose Adelaide because of the river causeways, like the River Torrens. So it was a very significant, having water, and that was one of the reasons why they chose Adelaide. I can't think of his name now. Colonel Light, yeah. So he was just buried over Light Square here. So that's a little bit of history of the place. But now I'll just do the welcome in the Kaurna language. Now I had to go back and learn my language. So I've been doing it from the 1990s, and I get to go around and do a lot of welcomes to country, a lot of conferences. So I really enjoy doing that because I get to use my language, because if you don't use it, you lose it. So now I just do the Kaurna welcome in the Kaurna language. Nai Tampati Tuwila Berikiana, Nai Tampati Bamba Bayurendi, Kaurna Yurtiana, Mariti Yunga Kaurna Miuna, Nai Wangadi Mani Nai Budni, Kaurna Yurtiana, Tarndanyanga Wadliana. So what I just said is that I just want to acknowledge the ancestors, also recognise Werribee Oldham's event is on Kaurna country, and on behalf of the Kaurna people, I just want to welcome you all here to Tarndanyanga, the place of the red kangaroo. So Natalia, thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank, for that welcome to country. And it is wonderful to be here on Kaurna country to launch our 2023 Australian Digital Inclusion Index. And I'm thrilled to be here today. And I will be launching today with our CEO, Vicky, the Digital Inclusion Index in partnership with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society at RMIT University and Swinburne University of Technology. At Telstra, we are very proud of the role we have played in supporting the index from its inception in 2015 until the present. We're also very committed to working in partnership with many of you, both in the room and online, to address the challenges that the ADII identifies. And for those of you that are joining online, I just wanted to make a special mention that we have 2 Auslan interpreters online today. And if you can search for them in the participants and pin them to the top of the screen, you will be able to toggle between them as they interpret for us today. And those 2 interpreters are Mac Gordon, that's MAC Mac Gordon, and Kiki Optenberg. Kiki Ochtenberg. So look out for those if you're looking for an interpreter today. And right now, I'd like to invite Telstra's CEO, Vicky Brady, to make a few comments. Thank you, Vicky.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thanks, Juz, and thank you to Frank for your warm welcome onto country. I too would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land we're meeting on today, the Kaurna people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also my respects and welcome to every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander person joining us in person and joining us virtually today. It is just wonderful to be here in Adelaide, getting to launch the 7th Australian Digital Inclusion Index. And it has been such an important collaboration, as Juz just mentioned, with the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society at RMIT University and Swinburne University of Technology. I too am really proud. You think back to the inception of the ADII back in 2015, not that long ago, and it's now become a real benchmark in terms of measuring progress on digital inclusion here in Australia. Now, the main event today, of course, is not me. It will be hearing from Professor Julian Thomas and from Dr. Lyndon Ormond-Parker of RMIT University, and they're going to take us through the key findings from today's index and research. And I did want to make a few comments just around the importance of digitisation and digital inclusion. Now, for many of us, being connected is just something we take for granted. We do it without even thinking about it, and our lives and our personal lives, our home lives revolve heavily around it. Now, even before COVID-19 turned our world upside down, we were certainly seeing a real continued shift and rapid evolution of technologies and how they were changing the way we work and live. And then the pandemic hits us and things accelerate further than we could have ever imagined in that period. If you think about how we were accessing telehealth services, the move to online education. I know for me, I never imagined a day where I would be working from home full time. My 2 teenage daughters would be schooling from home. It was just a very different world. And we also saw so much of what we access move to that online world. It was quite incredible. And today, post living through that, we are living in a new normal where digital inclusion is more important than ever. Now, we are seeing the digital economy. It is generating, incredible social, cultural and economic benefits for many, many Australians. But unfortunately, those benefits are not being equally shared. Now, digital inclusion is based on the premise that everyone should be able to make full use of digital technologies and the benefits they bring. Now, this morning, I was fortunate enough to join a 7:30 breakfast session with the South Australian Council of Social Services and many of their members, and also some very, very courageous members of the community here in Adelaide. And I've got to say, you can read the statistics and they are incredibly important. That data makes a difference in deciding where we focus and invest. But hearing those stories firsthand and just the impact of not having that digital access and the sorts of consequences and knock-on impacts it can have if kids aren't getting access to the level of education and learning that others with access are. Even being able to access just fundamental government services, particularly when people are in vulnerable circumstances, becomes more important than ever. And so the index is all about measuring those year-on-year trends in digital inclusion, and it measures across all states and territories in Australia. And we are going to see some progress, but unfortunately, I think we're seeing the progress starting to slow. Now, I don't think digital exclusion should be an inevitable outcome of increased digitisation, and there's absolutely a need for an ongoing conversation at a national level about what we do to address this. Now, we certainly have work to do to bridge that digital divide, and as Australia's largest telecommunications company, there is no doubt, I believe, Telstra has to play a role in that. How we work with government, how we work with NBN, how we work with others in the industry is so incredibly important. For us at Telstra, digital inclusion is actually very deeply rooted in our purpose, which is all about building a connected future so everyone can thrive. Now, they're great words and they're great intent, but I believe very strongly words and actions absolutely must be in lockstep. And so we have a real focus around the three core tenets of digital inclusion: access, ability and affordability. And just calling out some of the actions we are taking. Firstly, on the access front, there is no doubt our focus is around making sure we're expanding our network footprint to reach people, making sure we're leveraging new technologies like some of the new developments in low Earth orbit satellites, getting to some of those more remote parts of our country with great connectivity. On the ability front, we have a big focus on helping improve digital skills. And we've helped more than 200,000 Australians improve those digital skills through a range of community programs and through university partnerships, particularly including seniors and our First Nations Australians. And then on the affordability front, I know it was a big topic of conversation in the session we were in this morning. We've certainly taken steps to move away. We no longer have lock-in contracts. We do at Telstra have a number of brands and offers to help reach parts of the market and provide some of those affordable choices. And we also have programs in place that are helping to assist our customers who find themselves in vulnerable circumstances or in financial hardship. And to date, we've helped through those programs more than 1 million customers in those vulnerable circumstances remain connected. Now, Julian and Lyndon are obviously going to talk about the detail of the index today, and it's going to give you I think, a pretty clear picture of where the divide is the greatest and where the need for more is most acute. I'm particularly proud of the work our First Nations team has done with the ADII researchers on mapping the digital gap report. Now, the report will be released a little later today, but you're going to hear a little bit more about it. And in the ADII report that is released today, you will see a case study. And this is the first time we're going to have data at this level to give us a real picture of how big the gap is. Now, as I said, I, of course, in the role I'm in and where I sit and the things I look at, I see digital inclusion and closing the digital divide as just essential. It's essential for making sure as a country we achieve our economic but also the social benefits of a much more digitised Australia. And I'm really looking forward to the role we can continue to play as Telstra in supporting that digital future. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Vicky, and we're all thrilled to have you here to launch our Australian Digital Inclusion Index. And I now get the great pleasure of introducing our next speakers. So I would like to introduce Distinguished Professor Julian Thomas and Dr. Lyndon Ormond-Parker. Julian is Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society and is a Distinguished Professor in the School of Media and Communication at RMIT University. He has led the team producing the Australian Digital Inclusion Index since 2015. Dr. Lyndon Ormond-Parker is a research fellow at the RMIT University, the RMIT University node of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Automated Decision Making and Society. Lyndon was born in Darwin and is a Yalyawarra of Yalyawarra descent from the Barkly Tablelands region of the Northern Territory. And Dr. Ormond, I did try really hard to get that right, so apologies if I didn't quite nail that one. A cultural heritage expert with extensive experience in the fields of history of medical collections, repatriations, archives, information technologies, materials conservation, heritage and policy. Lyndon has held numerous positions across universities, organisations, government committees and boards. He's a Principal Research Fellow with the Mapping Digital Inclusion and Mapping Use in Remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Communities. And it's been wonderful for our team to be working with Lyndon. So can I please welcome you both to the stage?
Thank you very much, Justine. Thank you, Vicky, for those kind words, and thank you, Frank, for that wonderful welcome. I also want to respectfully acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains and pay my respects to elders past and present. As Justine said, this work is a collaborative project. It's involved a long-standing and very productive collective and cooperative project with our colleagues at Telstra, our colleagues across our centre, our research centre at RMIT and Swinburne, and other universities as well. And the work that I'll be talking about today also represents the work of a substantial and amazing team of researchers. So I want to acknowledge them. There's a vast amount that's gone into the last few months of bringing all of this together. What I am going to do is give you a brief overview of some of the key findings from our 2023 report, and then I'll hand over to Lyndon, who will tell you a little bit about some of the key findings of the work we've done in mapping the digital gap in remote communities, which, as Vicky said and as Justine has said, such an important part of the work we're reporting today. Now, as Vicky said, the index gives us a picture of the state of digital inclusion and its distribution across Australia, across our states and territories, across different communities, across people in different circumstances. The other thing that it does, which is very useful from our perspective, is it enables us to track changes in that distribution of digital inclusion over time. So that's the other thing that we'll be talking about today. There are some new elements in the work that we'll be reporting today as well. In addition to the First Nations score, we've also, in our last phase of research, dug a bit more deeply into the affordability questions, which Vicky signalled was a key area of concern, not just here, but right across the country, of course. And we've also been able to get more and better data relating to the Northern Territory. So there's a fair bit to cover, and I'm going to go as quickly as I can. Forgive me if I'm racing through these. It's important that I start by just saying a little bit about how we get these numbers together, what we do. Now, digital inclusion, as everybody knows, is a complex, multifaceted problem. So you've got to approach it from different angles. Since we began this research, we've identified 3 critical dimensions of digital inclusion. They are connected, they compound each other, but they can be also analysed separately and in a way which is actually very helpful for understanding the causes and dynamics of digital inclusion and what we can do about it. So this is a useful way to break down what is a difficult problem. We concentrate on 3 dimensions of digital inclusion. Access, which is really about how often and how intensively people are using the internet. Affordability, which is about what proportion of people's income is necessary for people to get access to good quality internet services. And digital ability, which is all about what people can actually do online and their confidence in doing it. I'll just take a moment to take you through those different dimensions so you can see what we're getting at in just a little bit more detail. In relation to access, as I said, it's about how often people are using the internet and how intensively they're using it, but it goes beyond that as well. What sorts of connections do they have? Because we know that makes a difference. How much data do they have? Because we know that's important as well. And what types of devices are necessary? We're past the stage where one device could do everything that people need to do online. So we need to look also at what kinds of devices people have. Affordability is a different kind of problem and a challenging one. What we do here is look at what proportion of your household income is going to be necessary in order to obtain access to a good quality service. We look at this at a household level, so it's not about individuals, and it's not about individual devices or anything like that. We look at the affordability of a bundle of internet services. So and you can see there on this slide the kinds of services we see as making up that necessary bundle for connectivity: a fast internet service, unlimited monthly data allowance for your fixed broadband service, and a mobile service also with a decent mobile phone data allowance. You'll notice that we see mobile and fixed services as complementing each other rather than as substitutes for each other. And we do that on the basis of the research that shows us that these kinds of services are good at doing somewhat different things and operate differently in a household. Now, just to sort of flag where this is taking us, I will say that we have found that the cost of that bundle of services has declined since our last report. The last key dimension of digital inclusion is digital ability. And here we're looking at a range of skills and capabilities, everything from what we call basic operational skills about being able to download and open files, right through to the more advanced skills involving saving data to the cloud, determining what's safe and trustworthy, navigating information effectively, and the social media, creative media skills that are necessary for people to connect socially in the contemporary internet. Also thinking about the kinds of skills that are necessary for managing our increasing proliferation of smart devices and the Internet of Things. Okay, so that's how we go about pulling the index together. When we do bring all those elements together, we can see some broad results which are really significant. So this is the national picture. I'll say a little bit more about the different states and territories in a minute, but if you can see here that digital inclusion at the national level continues to improve. So for our 2023 report, we are now, our measure for that is 73.2, which is up a little bit, up a few points since 2021. We can also see, and this is interesting, that the divide between metropolitan and regional areas, it's still significant, but we can see that narrowing a little bit. So they're important results. Now if we look at how this has changed across time in just a little bit more detail, I think this again gives us some clues to what might be going on. So on this chart, you can see figures for our 2020, 2021 and 2023 data. And you can see some gradual but marked improvements in access and affordability. What you can see also is that digital ability is remaining very flat. So that is growing much more slowly than the other two dimensions. So we can dig into all of this a little bit further. When we look at the geography of this, at the different states and territories, we see a pattern which has become familiar to us over the last number of digital inclusion reports. There is that significant gap, which I've already called out, between the metropolitan and the regional areas. There's also a very noticeable, a very distinctive distribution across the states and territories. As before, our highest index scores are recorded in the ACT, and we find that in Tasmania and South Australia, there are lower index measures. The other states are reasonably grouped together. Victoria is recording a score which is a little bit higher, but New South Wales, Queensland and WA are all around the same level. So that looks like some fairly consistent progress in relation to digital inclusion. It's when you look more closely at the social and economic distribution of digital inclusion across different communities that you can sort of start to see where the key gaps are. So this chart describes that social and economic distribution. Apologies, of course, there's a vast amount on this. There's a lot to take in a very short period of time. But what I just draw your attention to here is there's a dotted horizontal line there that shows you what the national average is, that point just above 73 points on our scale of digital inclusion. And you can sort of see where we're seeing particular groups, whether we define those groups in terms of their employment status, in terms of their age, in terms of their income, in terms of their level of education, in terms, interestingly, of what kind of housing they have. We can see where some groups are falling well below that level. And this really goes directly to the points that Vicky was making earlier. Now we know, irrefutably, that good quality internet access is essential for Australian households. What we're seeing here is that there are some households, there are some groups of people, including those who have most actually to benefit from good digital services, who are least likely to be able to take advantage of those. Okay, so that's the very broad social distribution. I'm going to just move through a few points really quickly, some key indicators. 9.4% of the population is at a level of digital inclusion that we would describe as highly excluded. They are registering a score of 45 or below, well below the national average. Now that number is slightly down from what we reported in 2021. 10.5% of the Australian population are reliant only on mobile devices, and that number has increased a little bit since our last report. Almost a quarter of the population are reporting what we see as a level of affordability stress. That means that they would need to pay more than 5% of their income to access a good quality household internet service. And 5% of the population would need to pay, 5% of our respondents say that they would often or always have to cut back on essentials to afford the internet. Just some of the critical gaps. Lyndon's going to talk a lot more about the First Nations gap, but you can see there it's 7.5 points, which is significant, and it's substantially greater in regional, remote and very remote areas. There's a very significant gap between those who have a degree, who have a higher level of education, and those who have not completed secondary school. There's a very high gap, 30 points almost, between our top income quintile and our lowest. And we know there's a very substantial gap, 34 points, between those who are 75 or over and those who are aged 18 to 34. So these are the lines of cleavage in our highly segmented and stratified Australian internet that we can see very clearly, and in some cases, these gaps are growing. I'm going to finish just by calling out what I think are three particularly sort of significant elements of all of this picture. Thinking about those mobile-only users, as we said, 10.5% of Australians rely only on mobiles. Now, the point we can make here is that this is not just about access. It's not just about how much data you have or how many devices you're using. You can see also there a very clear gap in relation to digital ability, what people can do online. And this is associated with the fact that they are mobile-only users. The second key point goes to digital ability. And you've heard, we have a story about gradually increasing and improving levels of digital ability in aggregate across the country. But what happens when we dig into these numbers a little bit, look at how different social groups perform and separate out some of these key elements? So we're concerned here that when we do this, we start to see what could be a growing gap in digital ability. If you look at this chart, you can see that for our top 3 income quintiles, there's a steady, fairly slow improvement in digital capacity, what people can do. This is absolutely critical for participation online in civic, economic and social life. But for those in the lower 2 income quintiles, you can see that there is a concerning decline. So this is something that we do need to look more closely at. We see a similar pattern when we look at a distribution of the population according to age or according to population. So what's happening there? Okay, the last one that I wanted to just call out for you, I suppose. We've said, and it's very good to see, there is an overall improvement in aggregate levels of affordability across the nation. That's good news. But there's a problem if those improvements in affordability are not being evenly shared. So if we think about which households are looking at paying more than 5% of their income in order to get a good quality internet bundle, who are they? And unfortunately, there are no real surprises when we look at these sorts of figures. Clearly, people in those lowest income quintiles are going to be in that group. Almost 70% of people unemployed, 65% of people who are over 75 years old, 64% of people in public housing, 55% of people with a disability, and 52% of people, of First Nations people, are in this situation where they're exposed to what we would describe as affordability stress. That puts them in a position where they're going to be starting to make very difficult decisions about how they afford the services they need for their families and what sorts of choices they make between essential services in order to retain an internet connection. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Lyndon. We've got on our website encouraging you to take a look at that because you can dig into all this data in much more detail there. We've set up some fabulous dashboards for you to investigate. You can download data, you can play with the figures and find out a great deal for yourself. Please keep in touch with us, ask us questions. Looking forward to the panel discussion shortly. Lyndon, it's your turn.
Thanks, Julian. And I would also like to thank Frank for the welcome to country and acknowledge that we're on Kaurna country. Thanks, Justine, Vicky and Julian. So today I'm going to give you a brief preview on First Nations Digital Gap 2023. Now, this is really the first time that we've had a First Nations dashboard as part of the ADI index. And we're going to take you through some of the findings and some of the findings of the Mapping the Digital Gap project. And so with the Mapping the Digital Gap project, we worked in 10 remote and regional communities, and these were our partners. We took something like 550 surveys and did over 100 interviews with individuals. So without these individual Aboriginal community organisations, this would never have happened. We wouldn't have had the data to actually present to you today. So Ready Enterprise Development, Jilkari Aboriginal Corporation, Paw Media, Yalu Corporation, Lunapoy Homelands, Woodrow Aboriginal Shire Council, Torres Strait Islander Media Association, Tumaroo Development Corporation, Columbia Aboriginal Corporation and Jarragen Community Council. So I think it's important that we acknowledge our partners. Without them, this would not have happened. So the Mapping the Digital Gap project, it's a 4-year study of remote First Nations digital inclusion and a partnership between ADM+S and Telstra. And I'd just also like to acknowledge Lauren Ganley from Telstra, who's worked with us every step of the way. She's the Indigenous engagement person at Telstra. So shout out to Lauren. We're also part of the supplementary to the ADII, and we completed our first visits in 2022 to 10 remote communities, which you can see on the map there, and worked in partnership with local community organisations. So we also employ 21 Aboriginal community co-researchers in each location, generally 2 people in each location, total of 21. We've conducted 495 surveys with First Nations people and also over 140 interviews conducted with service providers in those regional and remote towns. And by conducting the survey, conducting the interviews really helps us interpret the data. So this is another very busy map, which is the ADI First Nations page, which you can, if you're online, welcome everyone online, you can jump in there and have a look around and for yourselves. But I'm going to just take you through briefly the digital gap, as Julian said, at 7.5 for First Nations people overall in total, and against the national average. So, and that's the national average excludes First Nations in the data of 73.4. So the gap is 7.5. But we also see here that the gap widens as the more regional and remote you get. So it's in cities, it's minus 1.7, outer regional minus 12, First Nations remote, it's minus 24 and minus 25 for very, very remote. So you can see the access gap here. So when we're talking about this data, it's really important that you can see that it's really individual townships and places have a variety of experiences with access. So you can see in the towns here that we have Gungun Homelands right at the end, a minus 46 in terms of access and all the way up. So when we talk about data, we have data so that we can help fix problems. So that it's in collecting this data here, you can see where the greatest need is for community access. And here, in terms of affordability, this is a snapshot of affordability. Again, national, and then as you go out, we have an instance here where you have remote, and it's actually suggests that it's very affordable. And then you got very remote. So it looks like it's affordable. But what the data actually tells us is not a reflection of the reality in remote and regional communities. So this data is based on individual households, but where you have 8 to 12 to 14 people living in a home, it looks like the income is really huge and it's affordable. What we've also found in remote areas is 90% of the individual population are on prepaid mobiles, pay as you go. And as we all know, prepaid is one of the highest per gigabyte expensive ways of accessing the internet. And so I'd just like to leave it there and open it up for discussions shortly. But with the considerable gap in digital between First Nations and the rest of Australia, we'd like to see a lot more improvement in that digital gap. And this is the first time that we've had a national, really robust data to map that digital gap. One of the aims of the Commonwealth is to, they've set a target in the Closing the Gap target, which was to close the gap between First Nations and the rest of Australia in digital inclusion by 2026. Now, as part of that target, we are now going to be collecting robust data over the next 2 years to actually track that and see where the areas of need are to close that digital gap. So at the Commonwealth level, they've established a First Nations Digital Advisory Group to Minister Rowland, and I'm a co-chair of that group. And what we really are seeking and what we've found in the first 6 months is the lack of data tracking First Nations people. So what we're really pleased was that Telstra have announced an extension of the ADI index and for the First Nations data collection. So we'll be able to track that over time. But also we'd like to thank all of our community partner organisations for coming on board. Without them, none of this data would have been able to be collected. So I'd like to thank everyone and invite the panel to come up. Thanks.
So please keep the questions coming through on Slido and I will seamlessly navigate. Until then, I've got a couple of opening questions. So Ross, I might start with you if I can. So if you can grab one of the mics. And just in terms of what you've just heard, does that resonate with what you're seeing here on the ground in South Australia?
It absolutely does. And of course, the understanding that there are different groups of people for whom this has even more significant impacts is a really helpful one. And I think that it's terrific this year to see some of that kind of breaking down. I was struck by the association with people living in public housing. Now, in some regards, it's not unexpected because many of those people are likely to be living on low incomes. However, it also probably speaks to an underlying issue about the infrastructure that exists in that housing, and they too are probably people, many of whom are only connected on a mobile. They may not have any kind of other form of connection, and so that was very interesting. And I think the focus on Indigenous and remote communities, I think that's a very helpful focus to be bringing into sharp relief. I think some of what we need to do in relation to that context is to remember that this is, like other essential services in our remote communities, particularly important, and we need to actually have responses that not only include digital capacities, but include, access to healthcare and access to education and access to electricity and all of those other essential services. And in a sense, one of the jobs we might need to do is to think about how do we build the work so that we integrate all of those things into our conversation, not take them one at a time, and think, how do we address them one at a time?
Thanks so much. And looking at that suite, I guess, of basic services that are required and trying to build on the capability and the inclusion together at the same time. Great idea. Daniel, can you speak to your experience on the ground as you have been participating in the research?
Yeah, thank you, Justine. And I'll probably just start by building on what Ross has just said, that when we are working in the remote communities, we've selected 10 out of 1,500 remote communities around the country. We've chosen communities from different sizes, different levels of remoteness, different levels of technology that they've got available. So there's all sorts of different contexts that people are working in, but we didn't want to assume that people did have internet access. A lot of these smaller communities might have a public phone as their primary means of communications at the moment. And so taking that sort of whole of community approach meant that we needed to get a bigger picture of the way that services were available, the way people were using them. We've expanded on the survey to look at the way that people use the phone, access TV and radio services, access all the ways of communicating. So with each community we've gone into, we've worked with a local organisation that Lyndon referred to and community co-researchers. We've trained those co-researchers in delivering those surveys, and that's been the only real way that we've been able to build that trust and engagement and get the real stories from those communities, and really get the levels of participation you've seen. The next one is doing interviews with the various services. So looking at the health and education, the community councils, the way that people are providing Centrelink services, for instance, in communities or accessing those. And so we wanted to get that real whole of community look so that we're not just assuming that all of these services are available. People actually need to have these provided through, either face-to-face or online. And increasingly, as it moves online, it's becoming a user pays model. So we've really tried to get both the quantitative through the survey and the qualitative, the ability to get those stories, those quotes, and we put all of those into individual community reports to give back to the community their stories, their data to use for their own planning and advocacy. So that partnership with community has been critical.
Thanks, Daniel. And it's actually something that Lauren Ganley has shared also with me in talking about the research and the engagement, that it really does require on the ground listening and engaging with local communities, with local community leaders. And of course, all different communities have different needs. So there is no assumption that one size fits all in terms of the solutions that might be appropriate for a particular community. And really being community led, I think, is something that's been a standout in terms of something that Lauren shared with us. Lyndon, I might turn to you. What are you finding to be the biggest, this is a bit of a how long is a piece of string, but bear with me. What are you finding to be the biggest obstacles to digital inclusion in First Nations communities?
Okay, where do I start? I guess it's affordability in some respects and access to technology and infrastructure. So we've also seen one could suggest that satellite covers all of Australia, but also communities have to actually first understand what infrastructure and requirements are available to them as individual communities. Second is the issue of affordability, the way that people can actually buy and purchase internet access. So we've seen from our data that 90% of communities are on pay-as-you-go, especially in regional and remote, and it's generally prepaid Telstra, which is the only service available. And so we've seen that with internet access, for instance, with Sky Muster and the NBN, there's no pay-as-you-go option for that. And often where there is an option, it's provided by a service provider for telephone use. And so one of the interesting areas that we've seen an uptake of LeoSats in some remote communities, but again, it's generally the service providers that have the best access in those places, not the individual community members. So I think there's a role for education around what is available, but also there's a role for pay-as-you-go satellite internet service provision in some of those communities.
And finding that mix of what's actually affordable for the community. It may be that having a service rep from a service provider can actually provide a point of access, but is the underlying solution going to be affordable for the individual community or person?
Absolutely. And we also note the NBN has some free Wi-Fi services that they've rolled out to remote Aboriginal communities. I think they've got around 150. And one of the things that the communities have asked for is some sort of control over internet access. So at some of the points that NBN have put in, it's controlled by the community, so they can turn it on and off potentially in the evening, so the kids aren't up all night accessing the internet. So it's about telcos working with individual communities to find the solution that's best for them. But we also see that there is now a new role for LeoSats, and both I know that Telstra and other service providers are looking towards LeoSats as well. Some of those bespoke solutions, in particular where communities have no access at all.
Absolutely. Thanks, Lyndon. Julian, is the ADII open to collaborations and community partnerships? Who have you worked with in the past, and what gaps need to be filled?
Thank you. Great question. Short answer is yes. We are really open to working with communities, with all kinds of organisations, and I think actually the Mapping the Digital Gap project, which we've been talking about a bit today, is a fantastic example of how we can do this, not just in relation to remote First Nations communities, but with communities everywhere. We find we get a much clearer understanding of what the dynamics are when we go into these issues with a community organisation or a local organisation which is engaging with them every day. I think that you can also sort of see from the Mapping the Digital Gap work where we see possibilities for more work. The point that we're making that has come through so clearly since the pandemic, that good internet services are absolutely essential for every aspect really of economic, social and civic life, underlines the scope for further work in critical areas of service delivery, such as health, issues in relation to disability, for example, social services, the sector that Ross deals with. The questions that come up that Ross, you raised, and that we were struck by as we were pulling our research together, around what's the relationship between the kind of housing that you have and your digital inclusion levels. So all of these things are emerging as more and more significant issues. Essentially, it underlines the point that I think we've been making from the start, that as internet connections become more and more critical, the gaps also become more and more important in all kinds of domains of life. And we need to be looking at them all insofar as we can. For that reason, we can't do that, of course, on our own. We have to work with communities, with organisations in order to do it. We've had a number of successful projects already with state and local governments, with organisations of different kinds, and we're very open to further partnerships.
And what have you found in those collaborations that you've had before that have sort of been the one or two key ingredients to really make them work? I mean, funding's obviously something, but is there something else that you would draw out?
Funding's important because, resources are involved, as Daniel and Lyndon have been describing in relation to the work in remote communities. Really, there is no substitute for doing this work on the ground. This is actually the kind of work which, our colleague Dr. Jenny Kennedy has been doing so well in her research with Telstra and with others. I think what you start to see when you do that work is just a little bit more about how people are managing the sorts of situations we're talking about, how organisations are approaching them. So, we talk about, well, what's the sort of issue of affordability stress? Who is exposed to that? Which social groups are exposed to that across the Australian social and economic distribution? But when you do the kind of work that Jenny does, or the kind of work which Anthony McCosker does, you get to see how families are making those very difficult decisions about how they provide the resources necessary for their kids to get their homework done, or those kinds of questions. So they're the sorts of insights that we get, and it means that we ask sharper questions and have a kind of clearer sense of what these very complex interactions between affordability, access and ability really involve.
Thank you. And I will come to Anthony and Jenny. I might start with you, Anthony. Why has the affordability score improved when we know that cost of living is hitting low income earners?
Yeah, it's really, the findings are a little bit counterintuitive, I think, and it's something that we need to keep talking about, and we've talked about it a lot already. And I think we have some of the hints as to why we see the findings that we see. So in the period that we have collected data, the plans, the cost of internet has been fairly stable. It was fairly stable through COVID, and then just in the period afterwards, and we're really seeing that increase just now, and that cost of living crisis really bite probably after our data collection period. So firstly, we'll likely see change in those findings as we go ahead. And it's something that we have to remember to really pay close attention to. But when we look at the lower income quintile, so people in lower socioeconomic groups, we really see where the issues bite. So we did ask questions this time around about the way that people might be sacrificing essentials in their household for internet access. And, you know, we hear stories about people, I work with people in low income families that, you know, tell us about turning off the heating in winter in Tasmania and putting on more coats and jumpers. They prioritise the internet. They prioritise it for their school-age children to make sure that they've got you know, the connection that they need to learn and to learn at home and to connect with their friends and family elsewhere and stay connected. So, you know, these experiences are really common. And what we need to focus on with affordability is that that kind of flow-on effect that has particularly in the household environment. So Lyndon mentioned also that we have great diversity in terms of our households and household environments, and where we see those large households in remote Indigenous communities, that has a really big effect on the distribution of resources within the household around who gets access to what devices, who gets onto the internet at different times, what they can do, the kind of role modelling that happens within that household. And so therefore the sort of learning that happens. And when we see that environment is one of affordability stress, we see that kind of disadvantage replicated over time, so across generations as well.
We did hear a story this morning from someone that we had breakfast with that was very brave, that was sharing the sacrifices that you are talking about. And, you know, when you've got to make a decision between putting food on the table or a roof over your head, you might make that call to stop your service, or you may prioritise giving the service to a child in the family to be able to access for their education needs. And so that someone's missing out or something's missing out along the way. And just staying with you, Anthony, the older Australians don't tend to fare all that well in the index results. And I do wonder when those scores may actually start to improve, or if we anticipate that they'll continue to decline.
Yeah, there's this constant, persistent myth that people will age out of digital inequality, and it won't happen. We can say for sure that won't happen. The further that people get away from retirement, from you know, connection with the kind of technologies and the learning, the constant learning that needs to take place in order to be able to use digital technologies, the more we see their particularly their ability score drop, their confidence, but also issues around access and affordability. What we also see is often we have, you know, it's two-headed households, so partners who might share competencies, so they might share capabilities, they might share cost of internet and devices, but they also might share abilities. So one person will be able to do the online banking and bills and look things up and, even potentially move into buying groceries and getting home deliveries and things like that. But when that person passes away, then we have this really significant drop in the household circumstances around abilities. So look, these are problems that I think as a nation we have paid attention to. We have the Be Connected program, Good Things Foundation, and the network that they have built around this has been really important. As we mentioned, proximity to local organisations is really key, particularly for older Australians. They need to go, short distances to be able to seek help with digital technologies.
Thank you. And Jenny, I might bring you in if I can. So what could be done in terms of further research going beyond the data collected for the index, and what are the key problems that require more focused attention?
Thank you. I think in terms of what has already been said, what we know is that we need to take a holistic approach to understand digital inclusion. And that largely involves working with communities and with on-the-ground organisations and with individuals and households to understand their experiences and perspectives in terms of the broader context, not only of what kind of impact and decision-making and practices that are happening within the home, but also how they're accessing other services and how the capabilities of those services are impacting those families, and how powerful those stories are in helping us understand the data of the ADII, and providing new lenses by which we can interpret that data and think about new possibilities. So within those stories, there's also, like in the type of work that we've been doing with households, we obviously are encountering stories about the issues and barriers that people face, but we're also occasionally encountering stories of exceptions of households, and they offer insights into the kinds of actions we might be able to support.
What worked for them?
Yes, what works for them.
And Jenny, what is the data showing for people with disabilities and digital inclusion?
I think one of the for me, one of the things that it's showing is how we need to understand more about the intersection of disability and accessibility for digital inclusion. And that applies not only to people that are affected by disabilities, but also to those that are providing support and care for those with disabilities. So we understand that people want support to be able to have care within the home. So that may mean supporting the inclusion of the people within the home, but also the people that are there supporting them.
Thanks, Jenny. I might come back to you, Ross. How do you see the availability of public access services such as public libraries and community organisations impacting digital inclusion?
I think the public library system, our community centres system, have been incredibly important as mechanisms, particularly for people who are disconnected or not particularly confident about how to interact, or in fact have got stuck and they can't, we're told to ring or send an email, but if you've actually got stuck, it's very hard to do those things and to get your issues resolved. So I think the idea of having mechanisms that are community located, easy to access in close proximity to wherever you are, where there are people, not real humans, who can actually be there and who can respond to you, becomes incredibly important for all of us having, a final, there's at least somewhere I can turn where I know that I'll be able to get that extra assistance. And if you're someone who has a heightened level of vulnerability, whether that's because you're older or because you have lived with a disability or because you're unemployed and have been for a long time, or you're just a young person that, you know, for all that we make the assumption that young people know what they're doing on the internet, we also know that, in fact, there's a very low literacy around some of the things that they need to know as they're going forward. So I think it's crucial that we capitalise on that kind of social infrastructure. We'd add things like free Wi-Fi into those kinds of circumstances so that, and we know in many circumstances that's exactly what is available. And we'd move people potentially, or give people a potential option for not necessarily having to be in Macca's, or if you've got a Macca's in town, or in any of those other kind of commercial circumstances where you don't actually know where your data's going and what they're going to do, and you're not sure what's going to happen to your feed over the next couple of months because you've been inquiring about pregnancy testing. We think that there's a real opportunity for us to be thinking carefully about expanding and addressing affordability by creating free Wi-Fi mechanisms in local communities. And it's really important that we continue to support our public libraries as one of the faces of that, because it's a place where people feel confident, or many people feel confident going, and that they will feel okay about approaching in much the same way that our community services networks are and our community centres are so important.
I do think they play a critical role, and I think it's the Wi-Fi, the hours of operation that actually work for the community as well. I know, Lyndon, you were sharing before about free Wi-Fi on payphones, and I know that Telstra has a number of those as well. And we have been guided in some circumstances by the local community about the hours of operation that are appropriate, because you don't necessarily want to be encouraging young people out at night to a public phone box to be using the Wi-Fi. So I think, again, it does require that engagement with local community. And Anthony, maybe a similar question in terms of the role that, just building on what Ross had shared, the role that councils can play in terms of preparing for the infrastructure for the community of the future and making them fit for purpose, I guess.
Yeah, community councils are really good at thinking about public spaces and public places and providing them. And I think they hold the key for, well, one of the things that we've been working with some of the councils around Melbourne is around creating the circumstances for social connection, so that people who are isolated, who don't have that family member or friend who they can turn to solve their digital problems, and when they're stuck, they can actually meet others and kind of form those kind of connections that can help them in many ways, not just in terms of devices, but in terms of recommendations for health or wellbeing or disabilities and so on. So I think they play a huge role. They, again, are passionate about their constituents, about the people in their area. They're close to them. They know a lot about them. So they have really good quality data and understanding of demographics and who are in need in an area. And they have been probably the keenest users of our index over time. They've been really focused on the detailed LGA level estimates, and I think that's really important. They see in that there are differences that they can make at that level.
Absolutely, and I have been contacted by a couple of councils about when's it coming, when do we get access to the information, because it is such a key data point or data points in planning for the future of the local community and what the needs are. We're getting very close to the end of the panel, but I might just do a little bit of a whip around with a question to each of you. If I know we've been encouraged to jump online and engage with the ADII, which I encourage everyone to do, and I'll do a little wrap in a moment. But if there's a key takeaway or a question that you would like to leave with the audience in the room or online, I might go around. We'll start.
No, thanks. Well, quite a few, but just sort of picking up on some of the kind of themes in conversation so far, especially these thoughts around the importance of, you know, what we might call sort of civic and social infrastructure supporting communications and connections, whether it's libraries or local governments or other kinds of organisations in diverse communities. I think one kind of critical aspect of that, which has, you know, really become, you know, very prominent in my mind, and, you know, I guess I'm really inviting people to consider it and think about what we can do better, is, you know, how this infrastructure performs in emergency circumstances, on those occasions where, you know, we have fires, we have floods, we have pandemics. So our index, if you know, appears to present a sort of steady progress in terms of the, you know, an overall improvement in digital inclusion, with, of course, these critical gaps that we're identifying that do demand and require further work. But we know that we're now living in a country where everybody's digital inclusion can disappear instantly and unpredictably. So I think, you know, it's a really important question for us to see these issues as important, not just for particular groups, but for everybody. Mm-hmm. And to understand and to work out how we can respond better in future, knowing how many people were left behind when we encountered these problems last.
Thank you.
Nice, Julian. I think that idea of working out what happens when it all stops is really critical, especially in those kinds of emergency services contexts. And we've got a high likelihood with climate change, changing our environment, that those emergencies are going to keep on happening. And so some of our challenges, we've become so reliant and interconnected. What happens when it stops? And it will stop, at least at this point in time. So a couple of takeaways for me. Don't underestimate the power of income in addressing affordability. So many of you may know that the councils of social service, together with hundreds and thousands of people who rely on income support, have been arguing for years now that the rate of payments for people who are trying to survive on income support are pathetically low. It's hard enough surviving on a pension. It's even harder surviving on job seeker, and it's even more difficult surviving on youth allowance. And yet all of those people need access to all these essential services, including increasingly opportunities to be online and to stay connected. And in fact, sometimes it's the only way that they maintain their income. So get behind the push to increase the income support payments. Everybody has a role to play in convincing our governments that that's a really important thing to do. So get on board, and that will be one of the ways that we can actually solve the issues of affordability. But the other thing is that let's also get on board with the idea of we actually need a national strategy. We genuinely need, and a national and a state strategy. We genuinely need someone to own this problem. And we don't have anyone that owns the problem at the moment. We've got many people who own the problem, but they all kind of say, well, I own this little bit of it and this little bit of it. We need a national strategy to own the problem, and we need that to be integrated into state strategies to own the problem. Otherwise, we'll continue with all of these messes into the future, and people's lives genuinely are at risk. Many of us, people like me, will probably have the resources to find a way through. But I have contact with many people who don't have those resources. and they won't find their way through. They won't get access to the same opportunities. They will be denied all sorts of things. And it's really important that we own it.
Thanks very much. I totally agree with you. In one way, it's getting owned in the Indigenous space is with the Closing the Gap Target 17, which is for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities to be digitally included by 2026. It's a very, it's a very, I don't know, ambitious target is the word I'm looking for. But I think we can make inroads into that. At the Commonwealth level, they're going to be launching the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Digital Inclusion Plan coming up, which sort of sets out a little framework towards that. I think that there's a role, given the ADII data, for telcos to also get together and to look at bespoke and local solutions for local communities, in particular in the greatest area of need in regional and remote, not only regional and remote Aboriginal communities, but regional and remote communities in general. But I think with a good roadmap that we can achieve digital inclusion right across the country, and in particular with the introduction of LeoSats and the work of Telstra, NBN and others. Thanks.
These are all the key things for me, and particularly the a national and state-based and local plan coordination around that. But I just want to really briefly add that we're seeing the rise of new technologies really rapidly now. So AI, generative AI, has come upon us in 6 months, and it's changed a lot of things. And we need to know about the kind of capabilities that they introduce. The capabilities that people need in order to use them, and the inequalities that they introduce as well. We don't know enough about that yet, and there's not a lot of attention on that. And so that's something that we need to focus more on.
Key takeaways for me is that digital inclusion is based on factors that are already tenuous. We have people relying on devices that may be close to obsolescence or unrepairable, connections that may, because of other demands on the household, be unable to be met that month, as well as also precarity of housing. So how can you seek a fixed internet connection in a home if you don't know how much longer you're going to be there? I think also that the ADII data helps us identify where we can direct attention to develop more detailed case studies that can provide us the stories that help us then interpret the data and seek future solutions.
Thank you, and I'd probably like to echo what everyone else has said, but particularly, Ross, your point about having a coordinated approach to addressing these issues, I think is critical, particularly in remote and regional Australia. At the moment, we've had a market model where the funding programs are really, through mobile black spots and regional connectivity program. They've done a fantastic job in getting coverage, mobile coverage into those larger communities. We've now reached the end of the market model. We really need a different approach, and we have to be careful we don't have 20 different providers coming up with different solutions, that there's not coordination around that. So I think that coordinated approach is critical. We also need to go back and ensure that all of those services that have been rolled out are working effectively. So a quality of service monitoring to ensure that we've got full coverage, that people can access those services from within their houses, not just standing in the street, as is currently the case, and that there's a reliability of those services, particularly as we're moving out of reliance on copper and the microwave backhaul. How are we going to ensure going forward that the services that are going to be largely satellite delivered are going to work in the top end when there's monsoonal weather conditions? So all of these, I think, really need to be part of the thinking when we go forward into this next stage of ensuring that everybody has access to what is an essential service and is being described increasingly as a human right.
Thank you so much. And I might just get the panel to stay with me while I do a wrap, but if you can join me in thanking the panel today. So thank you so much for joining us at the launch of the latest Australian Digital Inclusion Index. The report and updated data is now live and online, so jump on board and interrogate the data as we have been encouraged to do so. And I did like the comments around the coordination and the coordinated approach. I definitely can say from my perspective that collaboration will be key, and it will be key in terms of our attempts to address the digital divide. One of the best ways for us is we can work together by joining the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance. It's a great way to share what we're doing, seek support from others, and together we can call for action on digital inclusion. I'd like to acknowledge the chair of the Australian Digital Inclusion Alliance, Mr David Spriggs, who is in the room with us today. Thank you again for joining us, and we look forward to connecting with you in between now and the next release in 2025. That closes the program for our online viewers. Thank you so much for joining, and for those in the room, I invite you to join us for morning tea. Thank you.